Utopia has been a theme through the 20th century. And this is the idea of an imagined place or designed place in which everything is perfect. We've seen examples of utopian urban planning. And in this particular lecture, we're going to look at utopia and technology as it's manifested in the later half of the 20th century. What we see is an emergence for a demand for the democratization of architecture through the mediation of technology. And by this, and what we're going to see in the lecture examples, is the idea that the social and economic shifts in the end of the 50s formed the demand for a new functionality and led to a reconception of architecture beyond the built secular object. So architecture as an environment, architecture as a spatial field for the expression of the relations and processes of an increasingly complex world. What we will see in today's examples is that from the late 1950s to the early 1970s, there were several groups of architects who radically modified the boundaries and definitions of architecture. The rejection of the modern movement, specifically the paternalist practices, and now there is a quest for an other architecture. These radical groups seem to almost unanimously attempt to orchestrate a liberation from architecture, which until then was perceived as a discipline oriented toward construction. What we will see are ideas like cities without architecture, architectures without city, objects without city or architecture, architects without work who are not products of these schisms or parts of the former project. The groups emerging from this disciplinary turmoil were not formed by a body of common beliefs, principles, and practices, but rather they come from the participation in a general reformative era. Now, we've seen Buckminster Fuller before, specifically in our discussion of World War II technologies. The examples I'll show you in the next few slides are for his geodesic dome. This was designed for the U.S. Marine Corps in the 1950s and again was proposed as a quick assembly prefabricated element that uses geometry to create an efficient and extremely stable form. Here you can see the cover of a document that was the study of shelter logistics for the Marine Corps Aviation. So in the 1950s, the U.S. Marine Corps put the geodesic domes of Buckminster Fuller to the test. They concluded that domes were, quote, the first major basic improvement in mobile military shelters for the past 2,600 years, unquote. This particular volume is quite rare and now out of print. So earlier in lecture we saw Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion house, and these military drive forms made their way into civilian and even domestic applications with some tweaking. In this image, workers are seen assembling the first rows of aluminum tubes in October of 1959, and they're building the Climatron at the Missouri Botanical Garden. The tubes created interlocking hexagons, or six-sided structures, to form a 70-foot high dome that needed no interior vertical support. So it allowed this huge open span. It was, in 1958, the largest clear span in the world. Other speculative projects include this one, the Dome over Manhattan, a project for New York City in the 60s. And in the 1960s and into the 70s, the idea of a domed city came out of science fiction and seemed like it might actually become a reality. The first of these is when Buckminster Fuller proposed a 2-mile wide geodesic dome spanning Midtown Manhattan. The goal of this dome was that it would regulate weather and reduce air pollution. While the dome over Manhattan was not realized, this project, the United States Pavilion at Montreal's World's Fair in 1967, was. This is now the biosphere, and it is the synthesis of Fuller's philosophy about building and art. Through the geodesic design built from triangles, which Buckminster Fuller felt was the perfect form, Fuller demonstrated that it was possible to create a livable space using only 1/5 of the materials normally used in conventional architecture. The biosphere became the primary attraction at Expo 67 and was visited by 53 million people. Another project that's much lesser known is Buckminster Fuller's tetrahedral floating city that he designed for Tokyo Bay in the 1960s. Needless to say, this was not built, but you do start to see how his imaginative, geometrically based imagination worked. So moving on from people like Fuller, and he's really sort of a unique figure in this conversation, we're going to look at a series of other groups, starting with the independent group. This was a highly significant collection of writers, thinkers, and creative practitioners who met at the ICA in the 1950s. They are most often valorized as the fathers of pop, but I like to think of them as critical thinkers who created practices about visual culture that focused on new ideas. Leading artists such as James Sterling, Colin St. John, also Rayner Banham, contributed to this interdisciplinary group and participated in many of their group events. So speaking of Rayner Banham, this quote is useful for some of what we're going to look at next. When your house contains such a complex of piping, flues, ducts, wires, lights, inlets, outlets, ovens, sinks, refuse disposers, hi-fi reverberators, antenna, conduits, freezers, heaters, when it contains so many services that the hardware could stand up by itself without any assistance from the house, why have a house to hold it up? So one thing that the independent group did is through a series of exhibitions ask exactly these kinds of questions. So Growth and Form in 1951 was a science and art exhibition based on a volume of Darcy Wentworth Thomas's called On Growth and Form. And what you can see here is an interest in biomorphic form, so biology, and also on structure. Another exhibition is Parallel of Life and Art. This is one example. This is an untitled piece. It's a collaborative work conceived in connection with the exhibition, Parallel of Life and Art. And this was held at the Institute of Contemporary Art, the ICA in London. And it was organized by Henderson and Paolozzi and also the architects Allison and Peter Smithson. The dialogue between life and art that the exhibition sought to stage is figured by Henderson and Paolozzi as a photo collage, an assemblage of black and white photographs representative of the work of the two artists. These are fixed on large rectangular panels along two parallel rows. Inscriptions on the far left of the panel, giving the last names of the artists, identify the upper row as the work of Henderson and the lower row as that of Paolozzi. The upper row represents life, and the lower row represents art. So in the upper row, Henderson's collage of 12 images features several negative prints, including one of a boy kicking a football, and another of boys bathing. Towards the left, a distorted photograph shows a man's face compressed abnormally, giving the impression of being squeezed between the two images on either side. And you go along here and you can start to see some of these different ideas that Henderson includes in his photograms and the composition. And then below we have art from Paolozzi. In this exhibition, an encyclopedic range of material from past and present is brought together through the medium of the camera, which is used as a recorder, reporter, and scientific investigator. The editors of the exhibition wanted to present life and art and the parallels between them. And what results is something that's not art, it's not architecture, but it's a series of conversations about what it means to make. Another well-known exhibition is This Is Tomorrow. Again, this idea of progressive design, looking towards the future. And here you can see this is the floor plan of the exhibition. And it becomes very clear when you see this cutaway how the different disciplines, we have the architects, we have the artists, we have the designers of graphic designers and designers of all sorts from the independent group that are able to come together to create these exhibitions as a form of communication, so a way of disseminating their ideas to the larger public through an immersion in these exhibitionary spaces. Now, Archigram is another very important group. It was formed in the 1960s at the Architectural Association in London by 6 architects and designers, specifically Peter Cook, Warren Chalk, Ron Heron, Dennis Crompton, Michael Webb, and David Green. We're going to look at a few of these different designers' projects in the next few slides. In 1961, Archigram, a name that they derived from the combination of the words architecture and telegram, was born as a single-sheet magazine filled with poems and sketches. As David Green wrote in the first issue, it was meant as a platform for the voices of a young generation of architects and artists. Quote, "A new generation of architecture must arise with forms and spaces which seem to reject the precepts of modern, yet, in fact, retain many of those precepts. We have chosen to bypass the decaying Bauhaus image, which is an insult to functionalism." Unquote. Archigram's vision did in fact succeed in inspiring a new generation of architects and architecture. Most obviously, their radical suggestion to reveal infrastructural elements and reverse traditional building hierarchies inspired the famous Pompidou Center by Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano. And their drawings and visions continue to be invoked in urban thinking today. Now, Archigram stood out among this very sort of general reformative period, this idea of embracing the future, by taking a surprising stand for comics as their vehicle for communication. And it shocked the architectural scene and helped to launch the group into the international scene. So here we can see Amazing Archigram 4, the Zoom issue, is a science fiction related issue, and it became to a great extent the epitome of what the group represented. Space Probe is another. It's a collage of comic book panels pasted together by Warren Chalk, and they provide images that came to define the magazine, group, and the common agenda. Amazing Archigram really signaled the moment when comics finally entered the mainstream architectural imagination, spawning the interest of the discipline in this particular medium of communication. And here you can see some of these different, the Space Probe. If you've not seen any of the Archigram comic strips, I encourage you to check some of them out. So right away when you look at these, you could see the mixing of disciplines. This is not an architectural drawing. It is a collage, it is a montage, it is a mixing of media. And now let's look at a few projects. This is Sin Center, also known as Entertainment Palace, and it was Michael Webb's final student thesis project. It actually received a failing grade at the Regent Street Polytechnic, even after receiving recognition from the Museum of Modern Art as a Technic icon. And again, despite that failing grade, it was also featured in Archigram 2. It was proposed for the site on Empire Theatre in Leicester Square in London. And in this project, Webb attempted to bring together separate elements of showtime audience and parked cars with inclined planes that form a winding ramp system. The entertainment palace consists of a bowling alley, a cinema, theater, coffee bars, and dance areas. Furthermore, there's a large department store at the ground level and office space above. The spaces are designed to allow for easy circulation around the facility. Crossover ramps allow easy movement for the cars and parking. Cables hold the entire structure together, and the floors are hung by tension cables from heavy cantilever beams supported off the top of staircase towers. So here, let's pause for a second and consider the idea of Utopia. So some sort of idealized entertainment palace and technology. So this particular structure is only made possible through new technological means, new material sciences, a new understanding of structure. Between 1960 and 1974, Archigram created over 900 drawings, among them the plan for the Plug-in City by Peter Cook and Ron Heron. This provocative project suggests a hypothetical fantasy city containing modular residential units that plug in to a central infrastructure megamachine. The plug-in city is in fact not a city, but a constantly evolving megastructure that incorporates residences, transportation, and other essential services that are all movable by giant cranes. The vision that Heron and Cook had for the plug-in city is for a computer-controlled society where buildings are in fact kind of expendable. The project questions, quote, "What if the whole urban environment were structured for change?" unquote. Their design response is a dramatic, endless cityscape of stacked capsules on superstructures, locking together yet easily removable by crane. In Archigram 4, Warren Chalk writes, quote, "The home, the whole city, and the frozen pea pack are one in the same," unquote. A real manifesto of the plug-in concept. On the same page, Chalk wrote, quote, "The idea of an expendable environment is somehow akin to anarchy, as it, in order to make it work, we would bulldoze Westminster Abbey," unquote. He is right about the attitude toward expendability. And the idea of the plug-in city was called soulless in the Sunday Times article of 1964. In the drawings, the plug-in city is envisioned to encompass huge areas of land as superstructures connecting the ends of the country. Yet, each building outcrop is deliberately different to avoid being a deadly piece of built mathematics. So they're clearly rejecting that universal idea of modernism. Still, the laneways, cranes, and airships of the plug-in city are deliberately emphasized and are the constituent and vital technologies of the city. Whenever faced with questions such as, quote, "Where do the babies and seniors live?" unquote, Chalk, Cook, and Crompton would return to their drawings and invent a new plug-in. So in a way, the environment is both unwelcoming and yet fully accommodating. We can see that dissatisfaction with the status quo pushed the experimental architectural collective to dream of alternative urban scenarios. And this flies in the face of the superficial formalism and dull suburban tendencies that were very common in British modernism at the time. The plug-in city, along with other projects such as the walking city and the instant city, suggests a nomadic way of life, and more importantly, a liberation from the modernist answer of suburbia. Persistent precedents and concerns of modernism lay at the heart of plug-in city's theoretical impulse. In his book Archigram, Architecture Without Architecture, Simon Sadler suggests that, quote, "the aesthetic of incompleteness, apparent throughout the plug-in scheme and more marked than in megastructural precedents, may have derived from the construction sites of the building boom that followed the economic reconstruction of Europe after World War II." Unquote. The most controversial work of Archigram came in the form of the Walking City in 1964, created by Ron Heron. His creation sparked outrage at a London exhibition, as drawings and models demonstrated gargantuan tank-like cities mechanically moving on legs, crushing quite literally anything in its path. Able to stop and exchange citizens and amass supplies at stations, also by means of a plug-in system. According to Heron, his source of inspiration lay within Le Corbusier's statement, quote, "A house is a machine for living in," unquote, basing the perspective that the house also survived for you in the harsh environment of the aftermath of a nuclear holocaust. Cries of war machine and totalitarianism could be heard in much of the criticism of this particular project. Ironically, Siegfried Gideon accused Archigram of dishonoring the late Le Corbusier's name, even though Corbusier's quote was the keystone behind the Ron Heron project. A Capsule Home by Warren Chalk was the beginning of Archigram's extensive work with the word capsule. Chalk was commissioned to design a prefabricated dwelling space capsule, and the only constraint was that they needed to stack. The capsule home quickly became a study in ergonomics. Using cars as an analogy, Chalk proposed a system of total interchangeability. Each cluster of capsules would have a crane overhead for opening out or clipping in the highly sophisticated parts. They were imagined to be pressed metal, though pressed paper was also considered for weight. The capsules, though a separate project, were realized to be the necessary form of the mass residence in the plug-in city. The capsule home, even when separate from the city, inevitably implies a lifestyle of total urbanism, because they were seen as being a collective. And here we can see an example of a capsule home. These are the gasket homes. Another project by Peter Cook is the Instant City. And this idea was that using a hot air balloon or other flying vehicle, you could land and instantly create a new urban situation. So here's a close-up of the graphic. This here we see a Zeppelin activating the life of a small village in Instant City. I hope in some of these images you're seeing the sort of repercussions, the effects of wartime imagery. Right? Imagine living in the United Kingdom through World War II with the bombings. Then this kind of graphic showing these immense vessels landing over a city and changing it. There is an element here of unease and uncertainty. All right. Moving away now from Archigram, I'll talk briefly about Cedric Price, or CP as he was called. He was born at Stone in Staffordshire in 1934 to an architect father, and CP completed an undergraduate degree in architecture from Cambridge University and a diploma from the Architectural Association in 1957. After teaching at the AA and working for the architects Maxwell Fry and Dennis Lasden, he founded his own practice, and in 1960 began with his very first project, which was the aviary for the London Zoo. And you can see this image here. Employing the most advanced technology of the time, CP and his collaborators, Lord Snowdon and Frank Newby, used aluminum castings, stainless steel forgings, welded aluminum mesh, and tension cables to create a lightweight structure giving maximum flying space for the birds. While this is clearly an example of a built project, most of CP's reputation is chiefly based on the radicalism of his unbuilt ideas. But here we can see from whence his ideas were launched. His 1960-61 project, the Fun Palace, established CP as one of the UK's most innovative and thought-provoking architects. Initiated with Joan Littlewood, the theatre director and founder of the innovative Theatre Workshop in East London, the idea was to build a laboratory of fun, with facilities for dancing, music, drama, and fireworks. Central to Price's practice was the belief that through the correct use of new technology, the public could have unprecedented control over their environment, resulting in a building which could be responsive to visitors' needs and the many activities intended to take place there. Using an unenclosed steel structure, fully serviced by traveling gantry cranes, the building comprised a kit of parts: prefabricated walls, platforms, floors, stairs, and ceiling modules that could be moved and assembled by the cranes. Virtually every part of the structure was variable. Quote, its forms and structure, resembling a large shipyard in which enclosures such as theaters, cinemas, restaurants, workshops, rally areas can be assembled, moved, rearranged, and scrapped continuously, unquote, promised Price. Although never built, the Fun Palace was one of his most influential projects and inspired Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano's early 1970s project, the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris, and I hope you see the similarities between the two projects. Now, leaving the United Kingdom, where many of these ideas were being presented, we do see these in other parts of the world as well. So Jonas Friedman was a French architect of Hungarian birth. He had studied architecture in Budapest, but then he had left to complete his training elsewhere. In 1956, he attended Siam 10 in Dubrovnik, which confirmed his belief that requirements generated by technological progress and demographic growth were too great to be solved by traditional social, urban, and architectural values and structures. In 1957, he settled in Paris and developed the principles of infrastructure, a skeletal metal space frame grid of several levels on which mobile, lightweight, space-defining elements would be placed. He proposed to adapt these ideas for large cities by superimposing this grid on the existing fabric of London, Tunis, and New York, or by allowing commercial facilities to be built over the network of high-speed roads in Los Angeles. Like many of his contemporaries, Friedman concentrated on the scale of the city. His proposed ideal architecture is open in character, as these drawings of the Spatial City project show. The spatial city is a unit that can be repeated infinitely. All of the structural elements connected to the individual user, such as walls, floor slabs, and partitions, are mobile, and the architecture deliberately avoids committing itself to any particular style or pattern of use. Versatile as this composition is, however, it is contained by a set order, this grid of pillars and slabs on which it stands. Friedman calls this grid the spatial infrastructure and designed it for collective use. The concept of mobile architecture was Friedman's contribution to the 10th Siam Congress. It was during this session of the Congress that modernism was famously called into question as an outdated, static scheme, inappropriate for new global realities. Friedman's concept highlighted the relationship between social dynamics and architecture in the proto-postmodern world and suggested to architects how they could include that relationship in their thinking about the future. The Spatial City project is an unrealized theoretical construct inspired by the housing shortage in France during the late 1950s and by Yona Friedman's deep belief that housing plans and structures should allow for the free will of the individual inhabitants. Not wanting to displace the city below, Friedman raised a second city 15 to 20 meters above the existing one. The framework was to be erected first, and the residences conceived and built by the inhabitants themselves. The layout of each level would occupy no more than 50% of the overall structure in order to provide air and light to each residence as well as the city below. The project was designed for construction anywhere and was meant to be adapted to any climate. And we'll end with this project. This is the Cluster City project by Arata Isozaki. And it's loosely associated with the metabolism group in Japan that we'll talk about in the second half of this lecture. So Isozaki designed clusters in the air in 1960 and 62, proposed for the city of Tokyo. And the concept of the clusters was to develop a new way to structure housing around Tokyo. These clusters are supposed to represent leaves from trees, which are the housing units, and the core represents the trunk. So in these projects we see an innovative move away from traditional notions of architecture, the idea of clustering, of modules, of prefabrication. And the goal was to unsettle and unseat traditional construction methods and to introduce technology and utopia as a partnership for the future.